presentation of the Public Affairs and Special Events Department of KLRB News. And today, Dialogue Assassination with political research specialist Mae Brussell. And I'm Phil Kogan. Hello, Mae.
Hi, how are you?
What are we talking about today in summary?
In summary, the bulk of the hour will be spent on agent provocateurs, the discussion of who they are, why we have them, what effects they make upon our society. Dialogue assassination has to do with the murder of Robert Kennedy, President John Kennedy, and Martin Luther King, and other political people who could effect changes in our society who were assassinated in order to halt the changes they would make. And in order to continue the process of taking more power and going into a fascist state, you need provocateurs. The people do not stir up the riots and the problems that the leaders need in order to prove their existence, or the need for more TAC forces or squads and a tighter police state. They place agent provocateurs into positions to stir up trouble. And we'll go through, as much as we have time, a long list of they're well-known now, provocateurs who have surfaced and discuss the role that they have played to get us into the political state that we're in today. I brought in a book before we start. It's by Clarence Lasby. It just came out in December 1971, just a month and a half ago, 2 months ago. And I'm going to give the title of this book every week that I'm on the air and everywhere that I speak publicly. It's called Project Paperclip. I referred to it on one show before, and I'm going to refer to it constantly. Project Paperclip is put out by Athenaeum Press, and I've asked Thunderbird to carry those books. I'm going to every bookstore in town. I want them to buy this book and have it out. When people want to know which is the most important book to read on John Kennedy or the political assassination, it's a toss-up because there's so many good books out on the evidence that there was a conspiracy. But Project Paperclip is the story of the process of bringing over Nazis after World War II and placing them into defense industries, educational institutions, and this group of men were not held as war prisoners. They were brought into this country, and because so much of my work of political assassinations involves Nazis, people that Lee Harvey Oswald was with, like Albert Osborne, who sat on the bus with Oswald going to Mexico City, was arrested in 1942 in Tennessee for burning the American flag for being a Nazi. George de Mohrenschildt, Oswald's best friend, was George von Mohrenschildt, and he was apprehended, followed by the FBI down to Corpus Christi, near Mexico on the Gulf, for drawing installations, apprehended for being a Nazi, praising Himmler at the Petroleum Club in Dallas. My research, I'll go on and on and do a show, and I'm writing an article on Nazis involved in the assassination. General Dornberger, the Nazi general, was vice president and manager of Bell Aerospace. He still is in the Fort Worth area of Texas. It's one of the largest defense contractors we have. Dornberger brought over Werner von Braun, and those two men ran the rocket factories in Germany, the Nazi rocket factories for Hitler. And Michael Payne, one of the designers for helicopters at Bell Aerospace that Dornberger managed, that was the host for Lee and Marina Oswald. They stayed at the home of Michael and Ruth Payne. Those were the people that took Marina Oswald to New Orleans, that Marina lived with them while Lee went down there to get a job in New Orleans. She lived 3 weeks. When Lee Oswald returned, he goes right to their home. He went to the home of Michael and Ruth Payne, third-generation Harvard student, nuclear physicist, employed by Dornberger. Now, one of the things I will bring up about this book many times on the show is that one of the conditions of bringing these Nazis over was that if they were involved in any war crimes, they would be deported.
Now, before you go any further, I've been trying to get this in. Who brought the Nazis over and why?
Well, a lot of persons believed in our State Department, and particularly Navy intelligence. Certain men felt if we have these minds, these rocket scientists and these missile men, it will help us win the war against Japan. But there was a toss-up and a real serious question: did they really mean to go after Russia? in the Cold War, because the Nazi mentality said if we rule the earth from space, we control the entire world. And they wanted to continue this pure Aryan philosophy. Certain people in our State Department and in the armed services liked the idea of controlling the world and never being caught again in a battle like they had just gone through. And they brought these men over to combine their energies with our money and their knowledge, and the hundreds of them were brought into this country. And this book is about the controversy about how many should have been allowed here, what we should do with them, and the problem was, will they bring their idea of the super race and the master race to our country? And when the president just gave his State of the Union message about the money for missiles and aerospace, and the supersonic will go through, and the space shuttle thing is coming up now, the defense industry, they say our economy would be jobless if we didn't put money into space. There are many, many ways to spend our tax money that would benefit the nation. And this racist philosophy is perpetuated through these Nazis who have high positions in our government.
They still are in high places in the government?
Yes, they are. And when they went into the missile factories and found the slave labor and the bones piled up of these factories where Dornberger and von Braun worked, those men should have been deported. The condition was that if they were involved in war crimes, they couldn't stay. But they've become American heroes and very wealthy in our country.
Is there proof that they were involved, or is it just the fact that they worked where these things went on and they weren't responsible for them?
Well, they knew. There is proof that the missile factories worked on slave labor, and then when the troops came in, the bones were piled up, hundreds of thousands upon hundreds of thousands. I'll go into this book for one show if you want, but I don't want, if somebody hears one show and misses another, I want them to get this book because it's new, and I want them to carry it, and then they'll understand where their tax dollar is going this year.
Okay, that's Project Paperclip, German Scientists and the Cold War. It's by Clarence G. Lasby.
Yeah, that's right.
And it's published by the Athenaeum Press. So
now the death penalty, the California Supreme Court ruled out the death penalty, and the people of California, the people in Carmel, Santa Cruz, Salinas who hear me, I want to tell you that I think you should sit down and take time and write a letter and tell the court that you appreciate this decision, because the governor of this state, Ronald Reagan, and the Attorney General, Evel Younger, want to go challenge the legality of this, and they say it's against the wishes of the people, and I don't believe that. I think you shouldn't sit back quietly. If you appreciate the position they took this week and the brilliance with which they stated their opinion, you should write a letter of appreciation and not take so much for granted in this country. It was a major decision. Now, in terms of political assassinations, it was a good position, and I'm glad to see the officials in Sacramento screaming and yelling, because Charles Manson, Sirhan Sirhan, and John Frazier did not kill the persons they were alleged to have killed. And
that's a pretty heavy statement.
I make it every week.
That's been made several times before.
That's right. I make it all the time, and I think these men should be allowed to live and be separated where researchers could interview them and really get the facts of the case. They should be offered some kind of immunity for telling us what happened, like Valachi of the Mafia was offered a penthouse in a prison in Washington.
Do you think they really know?
Yes. Yeah, I know. Each one of them individually has said when the truth comes out, it will shake the whole system of this country. Manson has said it individually. Sirhan has said it. John Frazier has not said that much, but there's much evidence that there were many people up at the home of Dr. Oda. Now, this week when the death penalty was ruled illegal, Mr. Peter Chang in Santa Cruz, the district attorney up there, made an interesting comment. He stated that he was concerned that the abolition of the death penalty would result in more killings of small businessmen, end quote. I don't know what he's talking about. I don't think anyone on death row killed a small businessman. And we know that Dr. Oda was not a small businessman. He was a very, very wealthy man who arrived poor into the Santa Cruz area, made a fabulous fortune, and sent 7 brothers to medical school, had all of his children in private school. He made an extreme amount of wealth in a short time, and a lot of people are doing research into the Santa Cruz area, the drug traffic and the mafia, the syndicate, and at the time the trial was over, some woman yelled when John Frazier got the verdict of death penalty. A woman in the court yelled, "Don't the people of California know a syndicate killing when they see one?" And I tried to reach the attorneys for John Frazier. They took it lightly, walked out of the room, didn't interview this woman. But the people in Santa Cruz are doing research on District Attorney Peter Chang in that case. And it was interesting how he turned it around about killing small businessmen, because that has nothing to do with why John Frazier was in prison. And then San Jose Police Chief Robert Murphy came forward and said the death penalty was a definite deterrent in certain types of crime, and he cited the willful killing of an on-duty policeman or prisoner on guard. And San Jose Police Chief Robert Murphy was the man who defended his policemen, one cop in uniform, Officer Woolley, and two plainclothesmen when they shot John Smith coming home at 4 in the morning. This case has been going on and just was ended. Officer Woolley was relieved of any penalties at all. And Chief of Police Murphy said, right the day that Officer Woolley was arrested, Murphy said, I know he's innocent, he did this in self-defense. And that particular policeman had put mace in this gentleman's 2 eyes on a traffic violation, had sent dog out of the car to bite him, hit him on the head with a flashlight. He had multiple scars on his body, and then he shot him from about 6 feet away and just blew him to pieces. And the man had no weapon on him of any kind. He had traffic violation. So this man, the point is, if John Smith had lived and defended himself and gotten hold of Officer Woolley just in self-defense, then the chief of police said, well, that's death penalty for the man. The officer can mace you, throw out the dog, beat you up. And if you hit back and defend yourself, you get the death penalty for killing a policeman. Because in the confrontation, John Smith said to him, I'm going to sue you. And this was one of the off-duty policemen testified to this, and he said, not if you're dead, you're not going to. And he killed him. And so I think it's interesting that the interview after the decision on the death penalty by Chief of Police Murphy comes out. Also, I might just say in passing that before the verdict was in of whether Officer Woolley was guilty or not of manslaughter, before the verdict was in, while the jury was still out, Evel Young, the Attorney General of the state, promoted Police Chief Murphy to a part of his special California tax squad. And he had commended this man for the job he had done. Now, we're going on briefly for a discussion of dialogue with Bert Talcott, the representative.
Now why don't you explain how that came about, why it came about, and at whose urging?
Well, what happened, you were in on this with me. We had been on the air since late June, and about September there was a call from Washington, wasn't there, about a program on political assassinations. They called the station.
Actually from Salinas, from his field office.
He had called out there and said, what is going on? They'd received letters in Washington from people listening to the show.
Right.
And my answer at the time was that Representative Talcott didn't know what to answer to people who were saying open the archives or what is the story of the conspiracy. So my message through the field office here was that every research had been put down by public officials continuously, and what they said, we were misfits or loners or we made a lot of money off the assassination. And I said, none of these adjectives fit me or my research. I've spent 8 years cross-filing the government documents, the FBI reports, the witness testimony, and that if Mr. Talcott wishes to answer any of these people, all he can say is, I'm unfamiliar with the subject until I meet with Mae Brussell, because I don't know what material she has. Well, we had telephone conversations going back and forth between Mr. Talcott and the field office, and then he set a date for February and came to my home with Mr. Cody, and he came into my library, and there I have 109 books on the political assassination of John Kennedy, books on the Chappaquiddick acts of Ted Kennedy, the death of Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, and about 100 books on espionage systems and State Department papers, and 300 notebooks of newspaper clippings on all the political murders, and about 80 books of cross-filing of witness testimony. And he sat in my study, which I call my little archives. That's my National Archives. And he looked around, and he had no intention of wanting to know how I came to the conclusion of a conspiracy. I have to say this, he came out there as a representative of the member of Congress, and I feel that he didn't show any curiosity in anything I had to say. He had an answer for everything, and I didn't mind because I had an answer for his answer. And he looked at all the books, and he said, well, there's so many different opinions. How can you come to one opinion? And I said, well, I choose the books to study. If you want to understand the problem, take the books that have a volume number, page number, where you can go back to what the witness said, or like on the rifle ownership of Oswald. If you want to know how he got the gun, how he received it, where it came, did he really own it? You read all the people that were involved in handling that rifle before it ended up in the depository, the witnesses that are called, and the FBI reports, the Dallas police reports. And I told him I stick with books that have a volume number and a page number that I can look up the accuracy, and they're not just theories. I want to know all of that. His feeling was, well, there's so many books that you can't trust any of them. And when I explained how I do my research, he said, well, what is witness testimony? That's just one person's word after another. I said, it's under oath. He says, well, what does that mean? I said, well, then if they're perjured, if they lied, if they say things, if there's 552 witnesses and they lied because the FBI reports are different than what they said, they should be arrested for perjury. They're under oath. And he said, well, it doesn't matter. He says, what is the Warren Commission? It's just a group of men pointing together. It's not really a set fact. It's just a group of people. Well, you had this when you had the Commission on Sex and Pornography or Violence. If the president doesn't like it, he says, well, I just picked the wrong commission. That's not necessarily true. But here's a historic thing where they're to find who killed the president, because you're talking about the exchange of power, Phil. And you're talking about a man was elected by the majority, and he's killed. And you want to know if he was killed so that other decisions could take priority in the foreign policy, like recognizing the Dominican Republic, escalating the war in Vietnam. Even though Kennedy had ground troops or observers in Vietnam, that is no indication or proof that he intended to escalate, because there isn't one document available that he intended to escalate. So he said, well, what does that mean? So they perjured themselves. It's just a commission. And I said, well, let's get down to solving a crime. Let's be specific. The researchers want to go in the archives and see the x-rays of John Kennedy. He says, that's ridiculous. I said, well, you sent a government witness, Dr. Lattimore, who's a urologist. And we want somebody who knows x-rays to tell us how many holes are in this body. So then Representative Talcott says, well, when I was in the service in my platoon, he says, I had a gynecologist. Well, I could have made some really dirty remarks or fresh remarks if I wanted to, apropos of that. But we're not talking about military service. We're talking about an autopsy done on the President of the United States. He doesn't have to have a gynecologist or urologist in there. I mean, it's not a battle scene or an emergency. If James Reston is in China and has appendicitis, they use acupuncture. But if he's in New York, he'd use another method. And there are other methods of deciding what those x-rays say about John Kennedy. And I said, why don't you just open up the archives and let people who have done research 8 years or more, is that a fair amount of years? The original researchers, the group of us who worked 8 years or more, examine some of this evidence, and then we will be quiet forever. He says, oh, no, you won't. Then you'll talk about a conspiracy. And I said, yeah, that's right, we will. Let us see it and show that we're wrong and end all this talk. He says, no, we couldn't do that, because then you'd find something that's a conspiracy. So you can't go into the National Archives where the evidence is locked up for 75 years. So then he got us into another subject, and now this is where we swing to provocateurs. I brought up the subject of Richard Nixon's involvement in the assassination, and that offended Representative Talcott. He was taken back. He said, May, you have offended me, and you have offended 200 million Americans. And I said, well, Mr. Talcott, it's very important for you to know that I can't get on the American Broadcasting, Columbia Broadcasting. I'm not on the David Frost Show. I'm in Carmel at KLRB, but I'm not on the national media because they wouldn't handle this information. Not that it isn't true, but that we can't get to the people. And the 200 million people that I would offend would agree with me if they knew the facts. They'd rise up and want to know it was in the archives if we could reach them. And I pointed out a book by Penn Jones, Jr. called Forgive My Grief, in which, on page 85, this is volume 3 of Forgive My Grief, in which he describes the meeting that was held at the home of Mr. Murchison in Texas. And we read this on another show before, where there was a conference with Richard Nixon and J. Edgar Hoover in the Murchison home.
Explain who Murchison is.
He's a wealthy oil man in Dallas, Texas. And the night before the assassination, November 21st, 1963, there was a meeting in the garden of Mr. Murchison. And Penn Jones said, this is in quotes, when it was realized that the assassination of President Kennedy was more important than the Normandy invasion with General Eisenhower in command, the conference for the Dallas Project became essential, and the killing of President Kennedy was the most important takeover of a country in our world history, and all the major forces in this country were involved and had to be accounted for at the final conference before the strike. So a conference was necessary, and a conference was held. Since Richard Nixon and J. Edgar Hoover were in the Murchison home that night, we feel that we should report that the conference was held in that home, and J. Edgar Hoover, the task force commander, was present to confer with all his troops and to issue last-minute instructions to review the final plan and give the word whether to go or cancel as necessary, end quote. Now, Esquire magazine this month in March has a quiz on Richard Nixon. Do you know Richard Nixon? And there's a true and false section on page 125. And one of the questions, it goes down the line, does he have an ugly scar and wear glasses? President smoked cigars? The president was once a janitor. Then the 14th question on the true and false is, the president was in Dallas the day JFK was shot. And Mr. Talcott, Representative Talcott, said, was he in Dallas? And he didn't know that. Well, there were about 50 things that passed between our dialogue that Representative Talcott did not know about. And the important thing was that he could learn if he wanted to. And I gave him a book on facts about the John Kennedy assassination. He said, it's too heavy. It's too big. I said, well, you can learn something. You're supposed to learn. And he got really angry and said, I learn something every day. But we're talking about the overthrow of the government. So if I offended him on the Nixon thing, I showed him the section of the Penn Jones book and pointed out that there were a lot of things he didn't know. Now, he got concerned, and he said, well, why don't you get off the subject about political assassinations? He said, why don't you get into the Angela Davis trial? Because there was a conspiracy if I ever saw one.
Wait, repeat that.
He said, why don't you get into the subject of the Angela Davis trial if you want to go into conspiracies? Because there's a conspiracy if I ever saw one. That it lends itself, or it should be studied. He implied that it certainly looks like a conspiracy there. Why don't you concern yourself with that kind of a conspiracy? So I said to him, the Angela Davis trial is interesting in terms of a conspiracy, particularly since the allegations of Louis Tackwood. And Mr. Talcott said, who is Louis Tackwood? And I said, he didn't know who the man was. Now, here's the representative from the state of California in Washington. And Louis Tackwood is a provocateur in Los Angeles. So we're going to go on to provocateurs because Louis Tackwood is a man who worked for the Los Angeles Police Department who claimed that the Los Angeles Police Department, the Criminal Conspiracy Section, CCS, had prior knowledge of both last year's Marin County Courthouse kidnap escape attempt and also George Jackson's fatal escape attempt from San Quentin Prison, and he allowed them to proceed despite a certainty that lives would be lost. Now, Louis Tackwood has mentioned the man, a Daniel Mahoney of CCS Conspiracy Section, and Edward Birch of the FBI, and these men had knowledge. He says the CCS sent him up to the Bay Area to infiltrate the Angela Davis Defense Committee and the Black Caucus, and he cooperated with other police agents to suppress evidence regarding the Marin the courthouse shooting. He said the police knew in advance of the escape attempt and the plans for the George Jackson escape, and he heard Sergeant Daniel Mahoney say that George Jackson will never live to go on trial. Now, I say there was a conspiracy in the Angela Davis trial, just like there was in the John Kennedy, the Martin Luther King, and Robert Kennedy murders. This pistol that George Jackson had in his hair, that was planted. I'm sure that Brigham, the attorney, was killed. He's never been found to prove that he didn't bring the gun. They planned to kill George Jackson in Soledad long ago. That was the origin of the original shootout, but they did get him up there, and there is a conspiracy. He's right, but our representative has in his mind a communist conspiracy or conspiracy of the blacks to kill this particular judge and do the things they're doing. And he would not let me explain how the Jackson or the Angela Davis fit in with the national conspiracy, which they do. Now, the Louis Tackwood is a man who came forward in October, and there have been many articles about him since, and Representative Talcott should have known what he was saying because what he says affects the whole state of California and the country. Louis Tackwood is what he refers to himself a criminal by choice and a police informer. Crimes, he said, are always a part of the game. He likes them. He plays them like he plays chess. Now, he made various allegations which have not been disproven at all, and it's been since October. The LA Police Department won't touch them, and I'm going to read what they are. He claims that two of the Los Angeles Police Department's elite units, the Criminal Conspiracy Section, CCS, and the Special Investigation Section are guilty of dirty, murderous doings against the militants black and white. Now, we had this in the Special Enforcement Bureau, the group of the Sheriff's Department down there that was responsible for the Manson, what they refer to the Manson case, the massacres in Los Angeles. They knew Manson was going to kill. They didn't arrest him. They were in charge of the brutality of Isla Vista. These special TAC forces are a political branch of the federal government. They're not part of the local police department. They're a political branch. And TACWID claims that they murder the blacks and whites, and they're involved in all kinds of tricks. TACWID claims that the SIS funneled money and arms through him that he gave to Ron Karenga, who was the head of an organization called US, with the understanding that those weapons were to be used to kill Black Panthers. TACWID said that the SIS officers' instructions made the controversial anonymous phone call in 1965 that guns were in the Black Muslim mosque, and they weren't. He claimed that Melvin Smith, the main witness in the trial of the 13 Black Panthers recently, was always a police informer and an agent provocateur, that he didn't turn state's evidence when they were arrested, that he was always in on that. Now, the reason TACWID surfaced as a provocateur was that CCS and the FBI organized a special squad called Squad 19, and their entire job is to provoke violence in 1972 at the San Diego Convention. And that will be blamed on the leftists, and the object is to create a situation that will allow the president to invoke special emergency powers, leading to the arrest and detention of political activists. He said the CCS sent him to San Francisco Bay Area to work undercover for the FBI and the California Bureau of Criminal Identification and Investigation, and to spy on militants and infiltrate the Black Caucus and the Berkeley City Council. Now, this is really important because it shows that these TAC squads go all over the entire state. The LA Police Department has foreknowledge of the plans up at Marin, of Soledad. There is a national network conspiracy, and there's a statewide that links to the national. And the people who object to assassinations or the repressions that follow political assassinations and become politically active are enemies of the state. I brought in a little book, a biography, the political biography of Angela Davis, of her childhood in Birmingham, Alabama, and she was close to the family of where these 4 little girls were killed and bombed, and she saw the police department get off. And it's the story of her life, how she studied French and went to Sorbonne in Paris. And then she studied the Algerian police and how they killed anybody when Algeria wanted their freedom, how the police did the killing and held back the people that just wanted to run their own lives and run their own government. And it goes into her life at UCLA, where blacks were killed on campus by the police department. And she saw that it was no different than Birmingham, Alabama. And it tells how she got involved in her work, and she chose the way out to remember the Communist Party because she felt that Governor Reagan and Richard Nixon and Spiro Agnew were faces of the police state. And then she goes into how they have to come down on her when she exposes the police killings. You see, in the South, she sees that the policemen do these killings, and everyone knew who killed those little girls, and they're not arrested. And then she sees it happening in Algeria, and then she sees at UCLA, the blacks were shot on campus, and the people who shoot them get off. And what forces her to become a radical and a communist is that the police are killing. And TACWID is saying the police are killing, and they have foreknowledge of the killings. So you're forced into a position of being a moderate, which I still am, or radical in a sense. I am not a member of the Communist Party, but she was driven to that because she saw that in our system, the killers are protected, like Officer Woolley up in San Jose. It just goes on continuously, that they can plant evidence and kill. TACWID goes on to the charges, the 2 black Berkeley City Council corroborated his claim that he had worked with them, and he told them he was an undercover agent. And it was true. A motel manager said that TACWID stayed with 2 white men, 2 units, agents that were up there spying on militants in the North. And it's been verified that TACWID let them use his name to put a defendant on death row. Now, you see, these are the things that a representative should go into because they affect the whole justice system of our state if TACWID is right. And yet Representative Talcott didn't even know who TACWID was. And checking up on what TACWID was saying, it seems the things he was saying were true. And he went into a lot of details on that San Diego plan. Now, what has the LA Police Department done? Well, what do you think they have done? The LA Police Chief, Edward Davis, refused to allow any men from his special conspiracy section or SIS to be questioned by anybody. He said, we'll investigate the matter. But he said, there has to be a Bolshevik working in this to plan a story like this. He says, for 2 weeks, somebody's planning a story about the President of the United States being tied up with the LA Police Department, and it has to be a Bolshevik.
Let's continue with that idea after we...
In case you've just joined us, we're talking about informers and agent provocateurs. We have spent part of the last half hour talking about that. Mae, as a research specialist, and having done so much research in this area, of course, almost all your work is involved in agent provocateurs and informers. You've come across quite a number of them. Is this type of thing more common at any point in American history? Did it exist in early American history, say back when the country was formed, or has it developed recently?
Well, the bulk of my research was on the murder of John Kennedy and how evidence was planted against Oswald, and Oswald did not shoot the president, and that involves provocateurs, people altering evidence, using his name and ordering a rifle that was in his name. And then after I began to realize that Oswald was an agent of the Navy intelligence and was not guilty of the crimes that he was blamed for doing, and provocateurs are people that create a situation like plant all these books of communism in his garage after he's dead, but nobody saw him reading them before because they want the Cold War to go on. Or people in the State Department like Isaac Don Levine are working with Marina Oswald right after the assassination to give the Warren Commission a more communist plot to the motive of Lee Oswald when they know he's really Navy intelligence. And I began to study American history going back, again, to the Nazis and into the German period. And the most famous situation of provocateurs in current history is the Reichstag fire. And I was discussing it at home with my daughter, and the name was so familiar to me, and I didn't realize that she didn't know it. And I'll define it for the young listeners who were not old enough at the time or weren't born at the time Hitler came to power. He needed an excuse to clamp down all the people that objected to his policies. He was going into reducing the law system, altering the court of law, and taking away people to camps they weren't returning, concentration camps and tortures. And he was beginning a warfare state, arming Germany, getting ready to invade Poland and so forth. But in order to gain power and gain police, he had to tell the people that they had an enemy. And he told them the enemy was communism. And he had the Chancellery, which was like our White House here, and that was called the Reichstag. And the Reichstag was burned. Hitler was having lunch away, not too far away, with all of his top men, and they got word the Reichstag had burned down. And it was the famous Reichstag fire. And that was the beginning of Hitler just rounding up everyone who opposed to him. And he could put them in jail. He said, the communists did this. Now the communists have gone too far. They've destroyed these papers and these documents, and they've taken over our building, and this is too much. So he rounded up all these people and took them away, and I guess they were killed. And then later it turned out that the Reichstag was planned by Hitler, and almost everyone who helped plant the bombs to burn the building were killed. It was like people that worked in Egypt building the pyramids. It was very hard to find many people who were alive because after they participated, they were killed. And the reason this agent that we just talked about, Louis Tagwood, surfaced and decided after 10 years he wouldn't work for the LA Police Department anymore was that all of the radicals that he was to get interested in planting bombs in San Diego as the excuse to pick up the radicals, they would be killed too. He was to see that they were all killed. And he just decided this has gone far enough. And this is what happened in Germany. Now, the reason I mentioned that book in the beginning of the show, the Project Paperclip, is that the system in Germany of taking power and taking hold of the government that happened from World War I until Hitler came into power was brought into our system when the war was over. Reinhard Gehlen from German intelligence worked with our OSS and Alan Dulles, and they brought in the method of provocateurs. They taught our CIA, and Richard Helms was a man who worked in the black arts of intelligence. He's the head of our entire CIA now. His whole thing was the covert government, the hidden government. And that is to effect power through deaths of people. through dirty tricks. That was his first interest in love, was the dirty tricks department. He thought he'd be head of that right away, but another man was in line before him, so he had to wait his turn. And Richard Helms, the expert, Richard Helms was in Germany, spoke German, met Adolf Hitler, was very close to German intelligence, was a protege of Allen Dulles and the entire German intelligence system, and like covert governments and black operations, those, in quotes, the black money, the dirty tricks. And dirty tricks are the provocateurs.
Well, what I think is important in trying to illustrate this is maybe to draw the conclusion that if these things can happen in other countries, and in fact leaders of these type of activities, agent provocateur type activities, if those leaders are brought over to the United States,
where they did it successfully,
that theoretically at least you can demonstrate that the possibility that these things could happen in the United States does exist, even if it was impossible to demonstrate that they have taken place, and you are doubted there, if you can document that the same people were here.
Were brought over here from there, and that these things did happen there. Like you say, if you read The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich or any book on Nazi history, I have about 20 books now on Nazi history, the rise of Germany. And as I go into my research, and I have all these books on State Department, as I say, and espionage, it's very important to study the rise of Germany, because the link between the rise of Germany and the presence of Richard Nixon is not just hit and miss. It's very closely associated. This is why there's so many Germans in Washington right now, Kissinger and Haldeman, and he's got a staff of about 15 or 20 actual Germans who were involved. But the provocateurs that are behaving the way they are now as part of the federal government did behave that way in order to give Hitler the chance to be in power. In the paper this week, there was an article on the Berrigan trial, which is taking place, in addition to the Angela Davis trial. And they're being charged with the intent to kidnap Henry Kissinger. And the men were in jail for stealing draft records, draft cards. And while they were there, an informer was placed in the cell next to them, an agent provocateur. And now he's saying that these men were guilty of wanting to kidnap Henry Kissinger because of a conversation that was had in the cell.
Now, where did you get the word agent provocateur?
Well, you can look that up in the dictionary.
No, but I mean...
from the Berrigan paper?
I'm looking at the article that you're holding in your hand, and I want you to...
San Jose Mercury, February 23rd.
The word agent provocateur is used in this AP story.
Oh, yes, this morning. And I have, my file is agent provocateur, of all these things I've brought in. But it's used in the story in the San Jose Mercury that the agent provocateur was placed to frame Mr. Berrigan. I can give you a personal example. I don't want to get too far off the subject, but this is the way a system can work to hurt somebody. I've been on this show since June, and I received calls from a gentleman in Santa Cruz who was interested in my show, and he came down to see me, and he said he was a radical. He said he was a psychology professor and dropped out, and that he was a radical, and I had no reason to believe whether he was or wasn't. And he came to see me just before he left to go back east. He's working in a federal penitentiary. He showed me a work permit from Nixon's. They speed up unemployment jobs, at this period of time. And he's working in a federal penitentiary. And he came down to see me before he left, and he had a really heart-to-heart talk. And the subject goes like this: Mae, they've killed enough on our side, like King and Kennedy and Robert Kennedy and Medgar Evers and Malcolm X. How about giving me a list? He says, I know people who they can take care of them, implying, like if I were to give a list of 40 people that I think should be killed to get the power back into somebody's hands. Now, my mind doesn't run that way. Even if I say men were involved in a political assassination, I wouldn't want them to have the death penalty. So he wanted to give me a list of something like Agnew or John Mitchell or Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, and he sort of sounded me out. And he split. He said, now my address is in Santa Cruz. He says, you write to me, and we can take care of them. He says, we'll take care of those people. Now, can you see me sitting down and sending a letter through a mail to a man working in a federal penitentiary of somebody in the government that I want killed? I'd be put in jail for the rest of my life. See, there's a provocateur if I ever saw one. He was setting the pace for me like this guy, he corresponding with me, calling me, coming to see me, and going off, and I write him a letter and give him, say, one name at a time, and in that letter, and then I would be held for wanting to murder these people like the trial going on for Berrigan to get Henry Kissinger. See, honey, I wouldn't touch that kind of thing with a 10-foot pole because my mind doesn't work that way in the first place. But that's a good trap to get into. That's a provocateur.
Well, you've talked so often about the Manson trial, the Angela Davis trial, the assassination of Martin Luther King, of Bobby Kennedy, of John Kennedy, and you bring up the theory that all these are related, and immediately there are those who say, oh, you've got to be kidding, somebody who's able to tie all these things together. The question I want to ask you, Mae, is if you were trying to develop a certain political climate in the United States, say you were in the government, and you wanted a certain political climate to further your own political ambitions, it wouldn't serve, do you think, to have one isolated trial and pin your hopes on creating that climate out of one trial? That it would take a great deal of work in different parts of the country to demonstrate that the menace is everywhere, wouldn't you think?
Well, I think that the important thing is that you can go to any one of these trials. You can go to James Ray, or to the Los Angeles Police Department with the Manson, or the Robert Kennedy, or the John Kennedy, and you take any one of those murders, and if the evidence is examined by legal minds and researchers, and if the witnesses are called who should have been called, you would come to the conclusion who planned all the murders. It doesn't matter which one we get to first. See, they're all designed by the same person. They parallels run through all the murders. The banking and the funds run through all the murders. The assassins are seen at the same man is photographed behind the Lorraine Motel, who's in Dealey Plaza. It is a question of...
Wait a second.
Well, there's a photograph of a gentleman I can show you that was taken behind the Lorraine Motel, who was also photographed at Dealey Plaza, being taken off as a suspect by the police department, and he was never... The police had no other suspects. You see, there were men in the Dallas police area at the time of the John Kennedy murder who were dressed as policemen who weren't members of the police force. And they would walk off with men that looked like suspects, and then they'd all leave town. They were never members of the police force, and the men were never apprehended. They were just carried off. And they were photographed by other people on the street that day. Those are provocateurs, you see.
Why hasn't anybody heard about, for instance, the photograph of the man who's was at Dealey Plaza? And
well, the researchers talk about, there's a man named Vincent Salandria, an attorney in Pennsylvania, who spoke recently to the Women's International League for Peace, and he gave a speech to them on the reason the process of peace won't come about until you find out who killed John Kennedy. And that speech was published in Computer and Automation, and then because of my research, I see that, and then a little local newspaper here called The Nose carried articles of Vincent Salandria's speech. But it's a network thing through the media. At this level, we can't get to the major news media. A man like Representative Talcott sits in my home, and I could show him all kinds of evidence. But he doesn't say in the hour that he's visiting me, show me one example of a conspiracy. He comes to me with a smart aleck sneer on his face, with no intention of knowing the truth. This is why we're talking out, like Vincent Salandria's talking out, I'm talking out, Joe Jostein sends numerous letters out of Europe. We're doing the best we can with what we've got. But there's no way to get to the representatives in Congress. They won't touch it. See, before Mr. Talcott comes to see me, he clears it with Gerald Ford, because I made some remark about Oswald being an agent of the FBI, and Mr. Ford knows it, and Representative Ford. And Mr. Talcott says, Gerald Ford doesn't agree with you at all. He knows Oswald did the killing, And I said, well, I have a record of every meeting he went to of the Warren Commission, which was about 5. And every witness that he heard testify, which was just a handful of people. And you can't tell me that I can spend 8 years with all this evidence and documentation that he knows as much as I do. But you take his word, because his word is the government word. If they say that's the way it happened, that's the way it's going to stand.
And the reaction to that statement?
Just nothing. He did not intend to have the evidence. Now, you talk about how far does a infiltration take place in our society if there is a conspiracy. Here's an example of a very quiet provocateur of a type. It's a simple thing which came out. A new magazine just came out last month called MS. That's the Woman's Lib magazine. And if you buy the magazine in the very beginning, you'll find that Elizabeth Forsling Harris is chairman of the board and treasurer of MS. She owns MS, finances the money. Gloria Steinem is the president and secretary, but Elizabeth Forsling Harris is chairman of the board of MS Magazine. Now, Penn Jones... Chairwoman, pardon me. Penn Jones, the same gentleman who wrote those 3 books on the political assassinations, Forgive My Grief, has a newspaper in Midlothian, Texas, outside of Dallas-Fort Worth area, and he knows everyone in that area very well. He keeps cross files on these particular people. And Penn Jones had an article in his paper just last week called Infiltrating Again, and he refers to MS Magazine publisher Elizabeth Forsling Harris. And he says the fact that Mrs. Harris accompanied Gloria Steinem, the liberation leader, through Dallas. Now, I'm going to read what another researcher, Penn Jones, has to say about this. He said, since reading Coup d'etat by Lutwak, which is a book on the overthrow of governments, it is easier to understand the enormous planning and checking and double-checking necessary before the killing of John Kennedy. And Betty Forsling Harris was one of the high-level observers in Texas from Washington, and she left Dallas shortly after the assassination. And Elizabeth Forsling Harris worked for the Saul Bloom Advertising Agency, and she was referred to in Washington by their planners as their Dallas contact. Elizabeth Forsling Harris was a close worker with Jack Puterbaugh on the Dallas trip which cost the life of President Kennedy. Puterbaugh came to Washington from Minnesota with Orville Freeman, and he was associated with Billy Saul Estes. It was Puterbaugh who made the decision to hold the luncheon at Trademark because of the proximity to Love Field, and it was Puterbaugh who made the decision to take the unauthorized, unnecessary detour into Dealey Plaza. And Penn Jones is making the point that the decisions of the detour and the place to have lunch made Puterbaugh up to his hips in the assassination, and he and Betty Harris both worked at the Saul Bloom Agency and were never called as witnesses by the Warren Commission. Well, when I read Penn Jones' paper, I went to my documents that I've gotten from the National Archives of a letter by an attorney in the Warren Commission, Edward Conroy, to Lee Rankin, the chief attorney. And he said, why aren't we investigating the Saul Bloom Agency? He said that Oswald went to that Saul Bloom Agency during a 10-week period on 60 different days. He had assignment.
Who's saying this?
An attorney, Edward Conroy, and John O'Brien sent a letter in April 1964 to the head attorney of the Warren Commission saying, why haven't we ever looked into the Sam Bloom Agency? That Lee Harvey Oswald was at that agency 10 weeks. During a 10-week period, he had assignments there on 60 different days. Now, that agency where Betty Harris works decided the motorcade and the detour that John Kennedy was to take. Now, she takes over Women's Lib. I have another shocker for you that I'm going to do a show on of a provocateur in the state of California, someone well-known in the ecology field who's taken over the total ecology field. And the youth people are very hip to this person. They hang around him, and they think, like the Women's Lib think that Betty Harris or MS is a far-out magazine. I'm going to have a real shocker for you. But I have to do a little more research before we do a show on that. Now, I brought in some more agent provocateurs because Representative Talcott didn't know about Louis Tackwood. I don't think he knows about a new provocateur who just surfaced this month in February the 10th. He's a Chicano, and his name is Eustacio Frank Martinez. And the article that I read about him said that for 2 years he worked as a police informer among Chicano activists in Texas and California. And a provocateur, he plants evidence against the Mexican-American leaders to get them arrested. He goes into the movements and tells them that their leaders aren't effective, and he takes over and breaks up the Brown Berets. He was in Houston and Kingsville, Texas. In protest march in Alice, Texas, he jumps on car, caved it in. He sets up the purchase of guns for members of the local Mayo group. He burned a cross in the home of a Vista worker in Houston. He burned her house down. He was in a police lineup to create violence against the Mayo instructions. He says he crossed police line in an attempt to create violence so that there'd be violence against the Mayos. He purchased explosives for the Brown Beret, and then he blew his cover and had to go back to L.A. for a while where he infiltrated the Chicano moratorium. He continually advocated the use of illegal weapons and violent tactics so that the L.A. Police Department would come down on the Latin American group.
Of course, to say that, May, to have somebody come out and say he was an agent provocateur is fine if it's true. it does make the police out to be the heavies. But again, somebody who is in constant trouble with the police could come out and, somebody with a record could come out and make these statements and make himself out to be some type of hero or something like that to justify the fact that he's in trouble with the police a lot.
Well,
so how do you weed out the guys who are just looking for publicity, looking to see their name in the headlines, from the guy who really was working for a law enforcement agency and doing these type of things?
Well, the people who interviewed both Louis Tackwood and Frank Martinez did check out where they had been, what happened. Like, for example, he said that he was sent at the time that Tunney was speaking to attack him and shut off the sound system. And he was sent by the police department. Well, they checked with Tunney, and he remembered it. He said his assistant, Mr. Thompson, was beaten, and that he remembered this incident very well. Well, at the time, you see, the provocateur is never arrested. He's let go to do something else. See, the man was involved in many crimes. Like, you check it out this way. If he went into police lines and does violence so that other people are arrested, they all get arrested. Then the provocateur is free to go on to do another thing. See, he never is held. He's let out to keep working, and that's one way to check if he's an agent. Now,
well, couldn't he simply know of these incidents and not actually be the one who participated?
No, but if he's actually participating and he's never arrested, that's one clue that he works for the police department.
All right, so if you can establish that he actually was there did this thing, has that been established in the case of this Chicano?
In each of these claims, and each of the Tackwood claims, it has been established. Like he said, I was up at Berkeley as representing the LA Police Department. They checked the motel where he stayed. They checked the men that he was with, that he was an intelligent agent. The men that he was following around, they checked out what he was doing, you see. All of these charges are not, this is the importance of the thing, is that they're not just wild charges. They can be checked out. If Tackwood said, I gave information for the police as a state's witness, they wanted a conviction and send a man to death row. The thing that Evel Younger should do, and Ronald Reagan should do, is to get that case and open it up and see what the testimony was that sent the man to death row. And either say Tackwood's crazy, or we'll get the man off death row, that the LA Police Department, you see, the heads of our state, Richard, I want to say Richard Nixon, but he's over the whole country. Evel Younger, the Attorney General, is larger than the Los Angeles Police Department. And if Louis Tackwood makes 20 allegations and one of them is correct, then that should be adjusted to find out if he's crazy. But because they won't go into any of them, they just call him a Bolshevik, gives you an example of how they want to avoid opening up the case, if it's true. And he names the men who knew ahead of time about the Marin shootout, if it was all staged and planned by the federal government or the state government. Angela Davis's trial should be called off. I didn't know why, after the Tackwood thing came out, why her attorneys or the Soledad attorneys just didn't end the case right there until they found out whether Tackwood was right or not. I haven't seen a statement from their attorneys. I don't think they know any more than Bert Talcott knows. See, if I were representing Angela Davis or the two boys in the Soledad case, or representing the deceased Jackson brothers, in some form, I would want to know right there whether the case proceeds. Because if it was planned by the Los Angeles Police Department, then the trials up north are a mockery. They're just a false perversion of justice, like happened in Nazi Germany again in the courts, where the guilty were made to look innocent and the innocent were made to look guilty. And as long as nobody goes into the allegation of Martinez, and he seems to be knowledgeable, what he's saying now is that he is saying, in quotes, it does not pay to be an informer because when they no longer need you, they frame you, end quotes. And he goes in again, like the Tunney incident, and he has a tape recording, he said, of the criminal conspiracy section of the Los Angeles Police Department who participated in raids on the Chicano moratorium. And he tells of his work in these particular bureaus and the mischief that he was into. And there was a trial of Los Tres that will be reopened. He said someday that he turned an informer and sent 3 people to jail. Juan, Rodolfo, and Alberto, he said, 3 men were sent to prison. And they were found guilty. One's in prison for 40 years, another for 25 years, and another for 10 years. And he claims that this was completely contrived by the police department, that he planted false evidence on these men. Well, these cases should be reopened. He said now he wants a congressional investigation of how the FBI, the Federal Narcotics Bureau, the LA Police Department, the ATF, and the Special Force Unit of the California Department of Corrections cooperate in attempting political repression of dissident groups. Martinez said, this is what I have been asking for, and he surfaced, I've been talking about this for many years now, and he surfaced just this February and said that Congress and the state have to go into how he's demanding a congressional investigation of the interagency workings of the intelligence operative agencies in California and reopening the case called Los Tres. Now, this man was involved in these things. He sent them to jail. Tackwood was involved. And they want the truth told now. And it's up to the people, the listeners who are listening to us today, to begin to think about how do you appeal. You can't appeal to Evel Younger or Bert Talcott or...
you can or can't?
You can't. I don't know, Ronald Reagan. How are you going to get some sense into this thing? I think we'll have to find some lawyers, similar to the men that are representing the Soledad group, some sincere lawyers who, if there are any, who take one of the charges of Tackwood or Martinez and go into it and find out what is really happening. And if the evidence is destroyed or altered, go into another case and find out if they just take the charges that these two men have made. I say it would end up right at the White House with the political assassinations. It's a part of the same structure moving on down to your state level. I've always considered it that, and I consider the Soledad case and the Angela Davis just a branch of a total repression. And then we'll move into electronic surveillance and lobotomies and removal of the radicals, or anybody who says the system is oppressive, like in Nazi Germany, will be isolated or removed. But these men have screamed out, they've risked their lives, and it's a question of how long people are going to be kept back from knowing more about them. They don't get much coverage in the news media. They got the LA Times interviews, but there's nothing up here about them.
I mean, it would be interesting if you could find any instance where the government has admitted using these types of tactics. Do you know of any such incidents?
Well, there was a conference. I have 30 articles here we can't even read today of government agents admitting that they worked for the FBI and they planted evidence to start riots and so forth. There was a conference in Princeton this last summer on J. Edgar Hoover and his oppressive tactics, and agents of the FBI spoke up. One agent who planted a bomb at a bridge in Seattle and then killed the person who planted the bomb, hired that. Here's an article of a man in Houston, Texas. A Texas official of the Office of Economic Opportunity said today that a poverty worker accused of inciting Negroes to riot in Houston was an undercover agent of the city. Walter H. Richter, Southwest Regional Director of OEO, said that the man was named Carl Moore, and he told Senate investigators Thursday that Moore tried to inflame Negroes into a gathering at Houston street corners. Several times when we were inclined to question his activities, he said they were the doings of undercover work for the Community Action Agency and the mayor's office. This is in Houston, Texas. It's a too bad we can't. I always cry because we don't have more time to go into each individual case. We wander around, but the wandering is related too. You know what I mean?
Okay, and that article was an AP wire story printed in the Monterey Peninsula Herald for those who think that all your research is based on the Berkeley Barb or something. It's not. Yeah,
this came out of your Herald, and this was at the time after Martin Luther King was killed, and that goes into James Ray saying that we have to, Martin Luther King had to be killed in an election year, and an election year brought riots, and riots brought Spyro Agnew, because he was unknown till then he clamped down on the blacks, Rat Brown and Carmichael, and I claim that Agnew was selected long before King was killed, that they had in mind that he would be the vice president. So here's an agent working with the mayor and the community council, and he's supposed to get Negroes worked up and into a riot state. That is the definition of a provocateur, if I ever saw one.
Mae, what have we talked about today? In summary, if you can do that. What conclusions could a listener who has followed the show through this hour, what conclusions can they make?
Well, I would hope they would come to the conclusion that the people that effected a total state of fascism in Nazi Germany moved into this country and are in high places in power in Washington today, and that Nazis from the former German government were involved in political assassinations in of our public officials, the main killing of our presidents and civil rights leaders. But then the political assassinations aren't enough to change those leaders. You go way down into the mainstream, and people who recognize the police getting off with these murders or the oppressive tactics of a police state, they see that the person who is jumping the car, the provocateur who's starting the riot, isn't apprehended. And if you scream up and say, no, that man was shot in cold blood, it wasn't self-defense, you're taken off as a radical. And if they want evidence on you to lock you up, they plant evidence. That people are affecting the thinking of America, that we're in a state of chaos or anarchy, that we need police, we need those tax squads like the Soledad trial you were talking about on the air this week. People think we need those super agents with their sticks and mace and weapons because we have other persons who are paid agents in our society making all the noise, doing the shooting, staging the shootouts. And then that gives an excuse for more tighter policemen and surveillance on the people.
Okay, quite an interesting hour. You've been, of course, listening to Dialogue Assassination with political research specialist Mae Brussell. I'm Phil Kogan. I hope you have had your eyebrows raised a little bit. We always invite your comments and questions. You may write to Dialogue Assassination.